notice is that many of you, when you're writing your methodology chapter, even if you've done methodology of your research already, you have data collected, but you all struggle to see how should your methodology chapter look like, how many word count it should have, etc., etc. So I want to, let me see if I have it here, just to make sure. Okay, yes, it's here. So I just want to make sure that you all have an idea of how. First of all, your methodology chapter usually depends on what kind of a method you use, but is one of, it's like your introduction. It's not going to be about how many word count you use. So it's usually few pages. But what important is the quality of your methodology. That means justification of the method, the approach, the philosophy, data collection, sampling, validity, and reliability. No more on that, on quantitative and qualitative, will be today. Again, another session with Dr. Hosni that will talk about quantitative data analysis for anybody who wants to do primary data by using a survey, or secondary data of quantitative or statistics that you collect from other sources. So make sure that you attend that session, and it will be very useful. So usually you use sampling. However, also when you're doing interviewing, means qualitative. So the last session will be qualitative on Monday morning, simply because there was no more space to put the session on. But today, again, in the afternoon, there's going to be a session only about sampling and process, which is very important. And why I'm saying is important, even if you think, oh, maybe I don't want to do it, you don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Maybe you change your idea, maybe you do some kind of a research, and then you see that, okay, maybe I can add some kind of a quantitative or qualitative secondary or primary data to my dissertation. So don't limit yourself and say, okay, today I'm not gonna do any survey or interview, maybe I don't attend that session. There's going to be a lot of useful information shared with you, so make sure that you attend that. So when we go to the chapter, let me see if you can. So when we talk about chapter of dissertation, so let's just think about word count. What do we actually mean with each chapter? So as we said, when we submit our proposal and obtain the feedback, we need to have read around the subject, create a literature review. We had a session on that. Submit an ethic application, the session with Dr. Benoit, which was really good. And you can use a lot of that. Is already the recording already exists. You obtain your ethical approval. By the time you obtain your ethical approval, more or less you're done deciding what I'm gonna do. So you already have the approval, so more or less your method is fixed. Now that method that is fixed, you may say, I just want to do interview, but that's not as simple as that. Okay, we know you're gonna do an interview, you get an approval on ethics to do a primary, or for example interview, or data collection, for example by survey, but there is a process to that. You have to develop certain question to ask, either from a survey or interview, or if you want to collect some data, secondary data, or for example, if you're doing case study, in the case study, the same, you can, in a case, you can also include, interviews and questionnaire about the case that you're studying. So any form of data collection that you may have, it starts with process of preparing what I am going to ask, what I'm going to observe, what I'm going to investigate. And to understand that, you need to have your theoretical framework done, which is the discussion that Dr. Mujahid was explaining yesterday. And through that, and through reading what you can, I mean, the whole point of literature review to understand what others did and improve your work, so you can see if previous research done interview or done, for example, qualitative, quantitative, what they have done, what kind of question they ask, and how now I'm going to address this subject or this question, how I am going to ask certain question, and that should come from all the theories that you have created in your literature review, and the certain characteristic of the case that you're studying. So the methodology chapter actually is talking about, should I start with your justification of what kind of a method you use, why you have chosen this method, why do you find this fit to the research, the type of research that you're doing, or the kind of question you're asking. Eventually you may say, I'm choosing qualitative, quantitative, and then you have to go, what kind of approach, what kind of a data collection, and why this sort of, for example, and then you have to justify the question you are asking. How did you come to develop your questionnaire? From where did it come, the question that comes out of questionnaire? Because you have studied previous research and because you know what you're talking about, so that it comes all out of your theoretical framework. So writing up your dissertation, there is a very big mistake that sometimes a student do, and it's you always think, I have to do my research, then I have to start writing up, and that's a very big problem. And why? Because it's when you start writing, you understand to see how many things you have actually to write about, and do you have enough information, did you done enough? So there is something when you conceptualize something in your mind, and there is another thing when you're bringing it on paper. It's not that easy. So every time you're doing something on your methodology, you've collected something, make sure that you write down the process. So the main reason people lose mark because of their methodology is that they didn't provide details, that we don't understand. How did you choose the person that, for example, you interview? What about your sample size? How did you reach them? What was the date? How many hours was the interview? Who were these people? And eventually, what did you ask? And all of this. And then eventually, if then you collect the data, how did you process the data? And the process of data is different from analyzing the data. The process of data means you've collected 150 survey. Did people answer all the questions? Because if you have in 150, if you may have 20 questions are not usable, literally because people either didn't answer or there is a problem in answering those questionnaire. And the same sometimes in interview, for example, sometimes the interviews is not useful, sometimes they're biased. How many of these interviews are you reporting actually? So this information of how did you process the data? Okay, what software did you use? What kind of analysis did you run? Or when it comes to questionnaire, if you say, okay, I did content analysis, how did you do that content analysis? That's come to the methodology part, when you explain how did you process the data that you have collected. And obviously then you go to the next chapter when you tell us what is the analysis and the finding, but the methodology chapter should have enough details. Going overall of what is expected to be seen in your research chapter is your introduction, and making sure and make a checklist before you submit your dissertation. Make sure that you have done all of this. All of this exists in your chapter. So in your introduction, why you are doing the research, that's called justification, or the rationale for dissertation. Why is it important? It's a different thing. Significant of the dissertation or the topic that you're using. Rationale is, for example, is an issue. You can say, I'm sorry. You can say it's an issue that is current, that has been, for example, affecting society, etc., etc. Why is it important? Then you have to say resolving this problem will lead to, for example, happier society, a more fit society, or a better, for example, sell for companies, or a better leadership style in organizations. Why is it important? Who is it important for? So who you're gonna help with answering a certain question. So the rationale for research, and then the research question, brief overview of how you will do your research. And that's a brief overview overall of how or what the dissertation will have. Eventually you go to literature review, key literature, that underpins your research question: key theories, models, and concepts. And obviously, not key theories, models, and concepts in a descriptive way, in a critical way. Contrast, comparison, and examine, investigate, and all of that. So it's not just to say what are the key theories, and it's about what are the key theories, what are the difference between the use of these theories in different works, and usually what are the downside or upside of using any of these theories, or if they have limitations. In your methodology chapter, you will discuss how you will do the research. So starting from what sort of philosophy I'm gonna use, what kind of a strategy I'm gonna use, data collection and data analysis, and rigor in research. That means that you make sure that the ethics and to follow the ethics. If there was any issue with ethics, that's the place that you can address. Moving on to finding and discussion this completely depends and can be do 2 chapters. Why I'm saying can be 2 chapters? Because some people lose marks simply because their finding and discussion is just one thing. They didn't separate. The difference between findings is if you collected data, if you have done interview, if you have collected secondary data, means you read news and stuff like that. What is the pure finding of those investigation that you've done? So if it's a survey, what is the statistics, say significant percentage? If it's an interview, what they said, so you direct quote important things that has been said. If it's a case study or content, do you quote the content, or you have to show analysis in a form of a table or a figure, what the finding has shown. And then it comes to discussion. That's another story. So when we talk about findings, it's about what are the key findings, okay? And then when we talk about discussion, is how they relate to other empirical research. So when you have described the finding, that section finished, and then you go to discussion. So now what that findings, okay, relate to the other research that has been done in the area, how the findings compare within your sample, right? Then you have to discuss, because sometimes it's like this: you may done a research, somebody else done it in another country, you've done the same in another country, so you can say my result was the same, maybe because they are the same kind of the sample size, the sample that I have studied with the sample that this research has studied has same characteristic or have something similar. Sometimes the result is different from the previous research or other empirical research, and then there you have to explain why is it different. Is it because of the sample size or because of the characteristic of the sample? Sometimes you need to also compare the result within your own sample. For example, if you have done a research asking people the perception of for example, of an kind of a product, or their perception of their boss, for example, you will see not everybody answered the same. So you have to compare to see how people in your sample, within your sample, are different. For example, in most of the research, if you look, if I ask 150 people, and out of this 150, 75 are younger generation, means imagine 18 to 30, and the other 75 is above 35, for example. And you may compare how the answer of younger generation is different from the answer of older generation, or how is the answer of female group are different from, for example, a male group. The same, for example, when imagine you're examining the perception of people who work in a company about leadership style. Maybe within your sample, you see people who are in lower paid job with less power in management have a different perception than people, for example, who have a managerial position, get higher salary. They may be more happy about the leadership, and the people who are down. So within your own sample, how the finding compare, and how the finding compare with the empirical research of previous research. Is that clear, guys? I try to say it as simple as possible with a question, with samples of you know, some subject area, just making sure that you understand how your finding and your discussion should be different. So this is up to you if you want to put finding in a separate chapter and this discussion in a separate chapter. I did it for my dissertation simply because my dissertation was quantitative. So I tried to put all the statistics in one place and then go to discussion. And my discussion was not discussing so much the statistic, but what they mean actually. Then you have conclusion. So on each research objective, you need to have the conclusion and overall research question. What is the conclusion? What you have arrived to that? And eventually come recommendations. Some of you were asking me before about projects, the difference between, you know, a structure of a consultancy project and a structure of a dissertation. That's where the main difference is. Because when you do a consultancy project, we are expecting a more detailed, practical, managerial recommendation. While when you're doing a dissertation, I mean, not that we don't need recommendation, we do, but it can be also academic. So what should happen as a result of your finding? What other research should be done next to improve your research? For example, if you're doing consultancy project, you don't have to worry about how the research could improve, but you have to see what your result can actually do, or what are the implications of your result for managers in a more practical way. While when you're doing a research dissertation, what you have to do is that you have to say, okay, you've done the research, this is your finding, but you had limitations. So what other researchers should do to improve this, you know, future research in the area? For example, you may say, I talk about leadership. I investigated perception of leadership in companies, for example, in companies in West Midland, and I think that future research should focus on, you know, or look at another angle in, for example, leadership in companies in another area and compare, or for example, in another type of company. So what is your, you know, somehow your suggestion for improvement of the research in your topic? And at the end, there is a limitation of your research. And guys, so this is a very important thing. Why? Because underlining what are your limitations is actually a very realistic steps, because let's be honest, we have limited time, so that's a limitation. And we had 12 weeks to start and finish a dissertation. So that's one thing you should say. Time was limited. Time restriction is a limitation. The fact that we are in a coronavirus kind of situation was a limitation. So you could not actually freely travel and go to places, and you know, everything has to be online. So for example, last semester I had a student who really struggled getting people interviewing because the COVID happened, and all the people who work in companies, they were really struggling about the job security even. So they weren't in a mood to come and, you know, have an interview with anybody. So your limitation is the things that you wanted to do but you were not able to. So budget, time, you know, all the circumstances that lead for you to not be able to do the best of the thing that you could do. Is that clear, guys? If you have any question about the chapters, word limit, etc., now is time to ask. Damilola, tell me.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, please. My question is that, is it possible for me to use both primary and secondary data for my project?
Completely, yes, obviously.
Thank you
You
very
are
much.
able to do both of those.
Sorry, say again?
The only thing that you have to be careful is when you're analyzing them, make that clear. So what are those who have done, you know, some people do mixed method. So they use quantitative, qualitative. Some people do secondary and primary data. When you're reporting this sort of data, methodology and analysis, make sure you have separate section of defining how did you collect each one, primary and secondary. So it should not be one data collection method. It should be secondary data collection method, primary second collection method. Do you understand what I'm saying? You have to separate it. So what happened then, sometimes when we are marking, it gets complicated, we don't understand. So how did you collect secondary, what happened to primary? And then when you're reporting the findings, make sure that is also section. So you say findings of secondary research or data and findings of primary data. So these are separated. There is not only one finding, because you have used two different methods, and so obviously you have two set of findings, making sure they structure in a way that is understandable. So that's one of the reasons people usually lose mark, is they don't structure their work very well, because they understand what they did, but I don't understand. I have limited time to mark how many 50 work in 2 weeks, and then another second marker as well. So that's get complicated. So what I'm saying is that make sure that the structure of your finding is clear. I know how did you collect, sometimes people that have secondary data or they collect data from, for example, internet, etc., etc. They don't think that they have to explain where they get the data from. For example, they say, oh, secondary data was collected from internet and then has been analyzed. But how? What are these secondary data? Are they report? Are they collected from what? Are they journal article? If so, how many journal articles? So I always tell my students, make a table. If you're doing secondary or online search for your data collection, make a table. See what are these documents. Who has published them? How many articles you have used? How many books you have used? How many online reports you have used? How many news, for example? And these things means clarification and detail of how you collected data, and eventually how did you analyze it. If you have selected secondary data, how did you analyze? Usually you've done content analysis, how this has been done. People just write content analysis, but content analysis is a process. That means you will put the text in front of you, you will read, you will code the text to understand what words has been used mostly, what has been focused on, and what is missing. So what are these, the process has to be clear. So if you want a higher mark, and it depends, guys, sometimes some of you just want to pass. I don't want to say, but I'm just trying to tell you, if you want the best possible outcome, is means in your methodology chapter, try and also findings, trying to make a good structure, clear of how did you collect data, what are these data, and how this has been processed. And I'm not saying analyzed, processed first, because you have to process any kind of data. Is that clear, James?
It's Dami. Yes, I understand. Thank you.
James, you wanted to ask a question.
So you were explaining about the different sections that come in a dissertation. Could you do an abstract as well?
Yes, sure. Actually, it's a very important part. So the first thing is you write the abstract at the end. You don't write the abstracts in the beginning. When you have concluded your dissertation, more or less, and I'm not saying 100%, but if you're above 70%, means you've done your findings and discussion chapter, you're good to go, more or less, to write your abstract. So how do you form the abstract? The abstract usually starts with a statement of the aim of the research. So what is your general aim? This dissertation, and I'm saying again, do not write paper or this, write this dissertation. This dissertation focused on, etc., etc., or examined these, or for example, investigated something. So the overall aim of your work. Then you can say, then you can always have a line on the rationale or significance of this topic. After that, you can discuss key theories, a line on what kind of theories you have focused, or what kind of a literature or main topic of literature or theories has been, for example, literature on, for example, motivations and the push and pull factor, or for example, etc., etc., has been examined or has been applied. The theoretical framework, for example, if you've got a theoretical framework, was developed through investigating the following, for example, work or subjects or whatever. And then you go on to the method. So the method of the study was quantitative or qualitative, and data collection was done by a survey, by interview of this many people. The result, for example, has been analyzed, either SPSS or content analysis, etc., whatever you've used. And the findings suggested that the following, what the finding has suggested. And then the research has contributed to this topic or to this field of the research, or to, for example, shed light on issues related to this, for example, company, or this, for example, type of whatever it is you're doing. At the end, that's it. You know what I'm saying? You get the main part of each chapter and you describe it. So what some people do as a mistake, for example, their executive summary is actually like a literature review, or like is just an introduction. No, you have to just take the best part of each chapter and line 2 sentences or 3 sentences about it. Is that clear?
So what is the difference between an introduction and an abstract?
Oh, that's a very good question as well. In your introduction, you're only describing the overall aim and around the subject area. You're just saying, you know, this topic was important. You're just talking about the significant, the rationale, and why you're doing this study. You don't then go and say what kind of a theory you're using, or whatever the result was, or how did you collect the data. And what people usually do in the introduction is a more general things. If you, for example, if you're just gonna give you an example. If I'm gonna do a study of sustainability in, for example, venues, right? In venues that, for example, sport venues or whatever. I'm gonna, in introduction, talk about the issue of sustainability in the world, in the communities, for the health, how important the issue of sustainability is. I don't go through details, and how important it is for me to, for example, to investigate this, the rationale why I'm doing it. But in my executive summary, I just said this dissertation is going to examine the sustainability of this because of this issue is important. Then I move on, and in this dissertation, this kind of, for example, theories of sustainability has been investigated. This kind of methods has been, for example, and etc. 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 Is that clear?
It was just a bit confusing, but I'll find it out.
No, I don't want to be confusing. But you know what I tell you? Go to this. Do you see the chapters one?
Yeah.
Okay. So try to answer this one for your introduction chapter. Make sure you answered all of this question. And then what I will do, I will send you some samples of executive summaries that are good. And then you can be more clear.
Okay, thank you very much.
Does that help?
That's been great.
I think that would be more helpful. We are not allowed to share with you guys some of the previous work that are good. Unfortunately, this is university policy. I would be happy to do that. Actually, my students, they were okay for me to share, but you know, it's policy and I don't. But you ask a very good question, and I think that's an issue many students have. So I think the best way for me to make you understand the difference is to give you a good sample of a, you know, executive summary of a research, and then you will get, because the executive summary of a research is the overall process that a researcher goes and what they find. But in introduction, you're just saying why you're doing this research. I mean, you're just letting me know what is the topic. If like you have the first session with your supervisor, James, what you will say you want to do, why you want to do it, and that's the introduction. However, at the end of the dissertation, when you write everything and I ask you what did you do, You're gonna tell me another story. You're gonna tell me I wanted to investigate this, then I collected data, then my findings show that, and I think this will be useful for the future studies. You know what I mean?
Yeah, thank you very much.
The way that you're gonna describe it to me when you're just in a proposal stage, that's your introduction. But the way you're gonna tell me what you did after you have graduated is gonna be a lot more details, and it's gonna be about the whole process.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other question, guys, before I go ahead? You know that I like to answer questions, because I think, like, now both of you guys ask really good questions. For me, I try to give you as much details as I can, but I know what is research. You're doing it for either first time or the second time, so I understand that it's not maybe as easy or sometimes confusing. So I don't want anybody feel confused. Ask question, I'll be happy. Another things I forget to say, that from after the session finish on Monday, I will email you regularly and I'll update you on what you're supposed to be doing, because I know that some of you may not understand the importance of submitting the ethic on time and getting approval on time. I will be contacting you all the time, either on Teams, on Aula, etc., to tell you what you're supposed to be doing at that moment. But I'll try every 2-3 weeks to put a live session that I sit with you and I answer questions that you have. So I think that way I can help you also to have less stress about the process. Okay, just an overview again. We are talking about a 12,000 word word count, and yes, penalty applies if you write more or less. Each page, try to avoid writing a bunch of text put them in paragraph. Try to manage your mind, what you're talking about. Sometimes there are pages and pages of things that go through without, and it gets confusing. It's only text. Try to put things in paragraph. Think, okay, what I'm going to talk to be doing. Try to put things in subtitle, subheadings. Okay, so let's see what I'm going to talk about now, and how many pages I'm going to talk about it. So try to make it organized, and this way it gives your work a structure, but at the same time it's easier for the marker to understand, because let's not joke, you want to have a mark to pass, or a good mark to for your future. Another thing, use tables, charts where suitable, and then words in table counts. But for example, if you have done secondary data, if for any reason you have used data, you can put it in a table from where you get it. Your interviews process, you can put it in a table. How many people, what were their job or their position you interviewed, what, for example, etc. So the references are according to Coventry system, and I think they're still on Harvard. I'm not sure, but I will send you the updated version anyway. And I think it was Harvard from last year. But guys, this is a mark. If you lose, it's the simplest mark to get, 10% for your references. And the thing is, if you make a mistake in one reference, that means you make mistakes in referencing. So you lose mark anyway. Even if you've done perfection in for example, 3 chapters, and one of your chapter has mistakes, you've got mistake. I have to report that you've had mistakes. So you're going to lose more. So try to make sure that at least these simple things has been, taken care of. Word count, start with introduction, ends with recommendation. So read the references, the table of contents, your report on your executive summary, your title page. These kind of things are not going to be on word count. Just try it from introduction to recommendation. If you want something to be marked, put it in the main body, not in the appendix. So I'm not going to mark someone appendix, because in appendix they wrote 5 pages of how their methodology has been developed. It's not going to be marked. You can put the questions there that if I get confused, I can go and take a look and see what is happening there, making sure everything's okay, but I'm not going to mark the appendix. So try not to invest so much on that. If you write something that is good and you think is important, do not put it in appendix, put it on inside your text. Aula, anybody having issues? I mean, James, I know that I don't know if you have already been there or not. I have reported your issue with Aula already, but anybody else having any kind of confusion with Aula? Who don't understanding, have any issue? Okay. Adebola, if I send, if what James asked and I said I'm gonna send you executive summary, I'm gonna send to everybody, and I'm gonna send it on Aula and Teams, so you don't have to worry about it. I share everything with everybody always. So Aula has a lot of material online. So right now you're gonna have all the lectures that we're gonna have for these 3 sessions. You've got support documents. And obviously, I'm going to add more guidelines and stuff like that. So you don't have to worry about not having access to information. When we talk about primary research, okay, if you're in terms of ethics, and I know that you already had a good session on ethics, just making sure if you're using primary data, the letters, etc., has been all sorted out. So I had a student last semester who told me, oh, I'm going to do interview, but I'm not going to have the consent letter signed by the person before the ethics, because they did not respond me. The ethic application is coming. Nobody's asking you to get it signed, but what we want to see in the ethic application is you have it ready. So in case somebody, after your ethic approval, somebody said, okay, I'm going to do an interview, you already have the consent form ready. And what is the consent? I'm going to write, you're going to have the sample of consent form, but to have the consent form, you have to put information of your research inside. For example, in the consent form we are going to send you, the name of title is empty, is title. You're going to put your title there. So we're going to see that you have made the effort and you have prepared all the information when you're doing, for example, primary data. We don't have all the lectures PPT from this event. Will you upload your PowerPoint? Until now, you have all of them. I did not have it on PowerPoint. I have done everything on PDF. And every time you see a video, below or above it, there should be the PDF of all the lectures. So Laura, check again. You should be able to see that. Shouldn't be like this. I double check, but I have all the lectures PowerPoint, so no worries. Anyway, by the end of this week or beginning of next week, everything will be uploaded. And let's be honest, I put it right away, all the videos. It's just yesterday, the one of library I couldn't find for some reason. I'm gonna search again today, but I'm quite fast on that. I just right away get it and I try to put it there because I don't want anybody panicking. I want to make sure that this process goes smooth. I know that some of you are stressed, and I know that it's not easy to do research in such circumstances, but I'm doing my best, and I hope that you if you have issues, you don't keep it inside you share with me, because your satisfaction really does matter. I'm not just saying it. It's important for me, making sure that you I have provided things that was my responsibility. Okay. Ethics. Any question about ethics, guys? What about yesterday? And I think Benoit is the one who's going to approve you at the end. So that's why I invited him, because whatever he says, it goes, because he's the one who's going to give you the final, so your supervisor will check it, but even if your supervisor check it and things are not okay, Benoit will not be approving it. So I have, that's why I have invited him to come, because he is the one that is responsible and is going to give you the best answer. So if you have any question about ethics, not that I don't want to answer you, I want to answer you, but again, I refer you back to Benoit's lecture, and I'm going to upload because you still are in the proposal stage, so that's why by next week I'm going to upload everything you need on ethics. So all the form, consent form, etc., is going to be everything on your the ethics section 2. I think section 2. I'm going to update you on that. So everything's going to be there for you to have the ethics. But just please, and I beg you, be a little bit, you know, specific. So the biggest mistake students do in their ethics copy, because they're bored or they think it's just a form I have to fill out, they don't put in, you know, thought on what they're writing. So when they said, what is your method, for example, what is going to be your method of your study, just put one line, it's going to be quantitative. No, you're gonna describe it. If they ask you what is your aims and objectives, you define your aims and objectives, write properly, and everything. And you know, it's quite straightforward. Is ask you, for example, it will ask you yes or no question, and most of them is just no. You're not gonna, because you're not from health sciences that is going to have any kind of somebody mic is on. Just turn off the mic, guys. Anyway, I think somebody has to, let me see if I can mute everybody. I'm not sure. Anyway, so when we are talking about your ethics, the form is they're going to be there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna ask you to put some times and thought on your form. So the issue with ethics is the form goes to you and then go to your supervisor, and it just, because you will not provide enough information, it gets constantly rejected. And then you do the changes, because there's going to be comment and changes, and we cannot just, you know, ask you revise it and then we had to reject. It's just a process. I have to reject, it goes back to you, you have to make the changes that is necessary, and it goes back to your supervisor, and then it goes back to Benoit. So the process is time consuming, so you cannot do it last minute. And when they give you comment to say this file is wrong, upload that file, make sure in all the forms that you have submitted, you have put your name, the title of your dissertation, the name of your supervisor, make sure all of this is done, because if you don't do and you send it back, I have to reject it again, your supervisor have to reject it again. So it's not that, and then by the time that is the deadline for approval, if you don't have approval, that's zero. You can't do research. So it's important you consider all this point when you are submitting your ethics. Give it time and do it as soon as possible. If you have question, you can always go to supervisor. If you really think that your supervisor, for any reason, hopefully they're all helpful, but you think you didn't get the right, just send an email. You know, if you get rejected, just send an email to Benoit and just see what's the problem, and hopefully there wouldn't be any problem and we can just resolve it. And as he said, face-to-face research is not allowed, so ensure the correct forms are there. So that's the main reason why people don't get approval or takes a lot of time for approval. Feedback on your work. Okay, some of you, and just remember that you should have realistic expectation from your supervisor. Your supervisors have, you know, they know their responsibility. They have to answer you in 3 working days. When you send them something, they still have a couple of days to, you know, give you feedback, but they only can give you detailed feedback on 1 chapter. So choose it wisely. Make sure the first thing I would tell you to do is just contact them as soon as possible. Try to make sure that your proposal is in line and your ethic is done. And you know, if you're on that track, you're in the right track. And so for the rest of the chapters, they can give you advice and guidance. So nobody will read your whole dissertation and will say, okay, now I'm going to read the whole thing and I'll give you detailed feedback. That's not supposed to be. Okay, so your research methodology chapter, and I'm telling you this, but your methodologies are going to be different. But anyway, you need to make sure that this checklist is done. And the checklist is for your research philosophy, what kind of philosophy, and I refer you back for the philosophy and strategy to the lecture of Dr. Mojahed. He explained this completely fully, so I'm not going to repeat that. You already have the lecture on that. So your research philosophy, your research strategy, sampling. If you're doing secondary data, you don't have to have sampling unless you're reporting some kind of report that they have done sampling, so you can say that their sample size was this and that. Otherwise, you don't have to bother about this one. Your data collection method. So once again, if you've done primary, you're gonna have to provide all the details of how you've done, when did you done it, how many days it took, how many data you have collected, all the details of that. And if your secondary data, again, you need to say how many, files, articles, reports, from where did you get them, and then eventually you move on to analysis. If you have done a primary quantitative, if you have done, for example, SPSS, you explain, I've used this SPS software, I have, processed my data like this, and I have used this analysis. And obviously then you go to next chapter and you define your analysis. If you've done interviews, again, you're going to talk about if you've used the software or you've done content analysis yourself of the interview result. You're going to talk about, your ethics, rigor in research, and this is again, this is somehow optional. And then the limitation of your work. So that's what more or less I need to see in your methodology chapter. And anybody who's marking you, making sure this has been, explained. And you don't have to put, some people come and copy paste the research onion and say, you don't have to put, just talk about your research. If you want a good mark, just focus on your research philosophy. Just talk about your, work and give details. Yes, you need to do a grace. You need to do ethics if you're doing secondary data. Even everybody needs to complete their ethic form. It's the rule of university. If you do not do, you will have a mark 0. Okay. So that would be the importance of that. So what I'm gonna do, my tea is cold. I'm gonna give you 5 minutes, go get a cup of tea, drink some water or something, and then I'm gonna just go through your methodology a little bit more, making sure that we are all on the right page. Okay, guys? Just a few seconds. I'm gonna just put the mic on and mute. Okay, guys, I'm back. Is there any question that you have on the methodology chapter that you want me to address before I move on? I mean, I'm gonna talk about methodology anyway, but any particular question? Okay, so let's just go through that again. Okay, so we know the things that when we talk about methodology, you need to know is that when you're doing a research, you're talking about a systematic inquiry. So you're gonna discover some new information, right? Or you need to expand on some information that exists. You need to verify. For example, sometimes you do the exact same research that somebody did, but you do it in your country or you do it in your organization. Sometimes you verify. And sometimes you challenge the existing knowledge and say it's not anymore the case. When you're writing your research, think which one is your work. Are you expanding? Are you verifying or are you challenging an existing knowledge? And when we talk about school, when you talk about management and marketing, you see research is such an important, but at the same time complex process, because every organization you work for, if you graduate and you work for any organization, they're going to ask you or part of the team to do research either on a new product or eventually on you know, any kind of a structure that they want to apply, or they want to, for example, even within the organization, if they want to change anything regarding to, you know, human resource leadership or you know, a structure of organization. When we talk about principle of research philosophy, okay, we have a term called ontology, and ontology is concerned with philosophical questions such as what is real, what is reality, what exists. If you look at any kind of Hollywood movies who question, you know, people who are scholars, you know, or professors, you know, big poems, like famous poets, and you know, writers and novels, usually they are questioning really big questions of, you know, ontology. What is real? What are the fundamental part of the world? How they relate to each other? And you may say, oh, my question is nothing to do with that. You know, I mean, I'm just doing a simple research. But you know, everything you do, you're actually is investigating some reality, some kind of a truth. And so don't underestimate your knowledge and what kind of a research you're doing. You're doing something scientific, and it has a lot of values. And then we have another research philosophy, which is epistemology, which is how do we know? So it's about a study of knowledge. It's concerned with how is knowledge attained and what should we believe. So if you come to me and you say, my finding of research determine this and that, I would tell you, how do you know? And how do you know? Because then you explain to me, I've done a systematic research, I have gone through a process, and then eventually I have asked the right question from the right people, and this is how I know. So when we talk about epistemology, is concerned with the origin and a structure and method of validity of human knowledge. How do you prove to me that something is true? If I ask you, how, like, you come in the house and you said it's very cold outside, how do you prove it to me? You said, touch my hand, it's so cold. And that's what, how do we know? How should I know that it's cold? Because I touched your hand, it's really cold, your hands are really cold. And then we have axology, which is from Greek word forthe, that means the philosophical study of value. And many of you may have the research done on understanding the value of a concept, right? Value of something, value of a judgment, value of, for example, ethics, etc. Then we talk about empiricism, and you know, don't get confused. It's not that we ask you in your methodology to go that deep, but just we want you to understand what you're doing, you know, in a more holistic way. You know, just understand the importance of what you're doing. It's not just a research dissertation. It can be a new type of knowledge you acquire for you and even for future. I had students who've done really nice, you know, important research during their PhD, during their dissertation time. So give yourself credit for that work, for the work that you're doing. Empiricism is the theory that the only source of human knowledge is experience. So that's another one. It's just say, and you see people who work in health sciences, chemistry, physics, they have to go through this. They have to experiment things. So they spend you know, years in the lab to come up with the new knowledge of that is done through experience. And positivism is some of you, I would tell you, out of, I have now what, 55 students in this dissertation module, probably, you know, 20-30 of you will tell me I'm going to do positivism, literally, because positivism is something that fits very well with the topic of marketing and management. So positivism is an extension of empiricism. So is that knowledge is derived from experience, but it also believes that nothing is innate, that only that which can be measured is worth worrying about. So you would tell me, I'm going to do positivism. And what is positivism? Is that you come and tell me, I did a survey, I have asked 150 people, which is statistically is a significant, you know, I can, if you have more than 100, anyone who's doing survey, if you come to tell me how many sample size I need, I also would tell you more than 100 at least, because that's how you can say that something is statistically significant in whatever now it is doing. Now it may be a small sample, but it's still a sample. So positivism is actually driven from that, is that you come to me and said, I have done a survey in an organization, and I have asked question of 150 people what they think, and I could measure that. And because I could measure what I have asked, so that's something that was worrying about, and that's positivism. So if as a student, did the Coventry University send you any survey ever? Can someone ask me, did they send you a survey to fill out? Have you had experience of module evaluation, MEQ? I'm sure you had. If you had, that's positivism. That's what I'm saying. I've asked questions from students, and I could measure that. I can say how many % are satisfied, and I make decision based on that. And that's positivism. That means what I've asked, because I could measure it, is right. Does that make sense, guys? Do you think positive? That means I've asked a question, and this percentage I trust is worthy, so I'm not going to question the whole things around it. I'm not going to ask, you know, some of you as a students, you are moody, right? I'm a moody person. I may wake up and not be in a good mood. So probably maybe if I go to a classroom, I will not be performing that well because I'm not just in a good mood, right? And it's the same. Studies shows that students, for example, when you're filling out a questionnaire, they're also sometimes biased. For example, all of you have marked your professors that are men better than women. The study shows that when you talk about students, how they perceive and the percentage of their satisfaction from the professors, men always get higher. And no matter what they do, sometimes you go to and they did not even do the basic things, for example, in Moodle, but they get higher mark because, I mean, you may be moody. And then I can question and say, but why, my boss, why do you believe in these statistics? Students didn't have a good day that day. Maybe the statistic is not good, but it's irrelevant. They're applying positivism approach. That means we've asked a certain question, we require a statistic, a number, and we trust it. And many of you who's gonna do survey is gonna do positivism, because you said, I'm gonna ask some certain question, I'm gonna require some data that is measurable, and I trust that measure. And many of you gonna do interview, I'm gonna use the NVivo software to you know, sometimes you use the software to also you know, evaluate all that kind of interviews that you have done. And some of you also may say that's positivism. They said it like that, and somehow with the software I could measure what they said and come up with some sort of, you know, generalization. So that's also positivism. So positivism argued that metaphysical speculation is nonsensical. So we talk about moral and values statements, nothing moral. So everything is numeric, and if I have the statistic, is right. Everybody who works in election campaigns, and they constantly are running over a statistic so how people are going to vote, that's positivism. If they vote like this, they're going to vote like that, for example, next week. That's positivism. And I'm explaining a lot on positivism because I know that many of you are going to apply that. Realism is the process that what the sense shows as a reality in the truth. So this suggests that there is a reality out there that is independent of the mind. So no matter what you think, is about reality of what you think. For example, if I come and tell you, okay, today now is a day because there is light, and nobody's going to question, and you may say, no, it's the night for me, I feel like this and that, and if maybe some people of philosophy will come and give you something, but it's a realistic, being realistic, that today now the sun is shining is a day, that's it. So realism, if you all are aware of what is realism. Interpretivism relate to idealism, so holds the view that the world is the creation of mind, the world is interpreted through mind. So it challenges the scientific method of investigation put forward by empiricism and positivism. So that's people who study philosophy, people who study psychology, a lot of those people may want to do interpretivism because they just question the whole thing of how the mind interpret. And so it assumes that access to reality, given or socially constructed, is only through social constructs such as language, conscious, shared meaning, and instrument. And this is, I don't think many of you are going to apply that in your work. So what you're gonna do is probably mostly positivism, or you know, I'm not saying so much of moralism, but anyway, so go back to the lecture of you know, Dr. Mojahed and Dr. Natalia, and you know, I'm gonna also upload a book of research methodology. I know that yesterday Becky's, I see the presentation was wonderful. It's gonna help you a lot, and you're gonna find a lot of books also in the library about research method, which is very important for your research methodology chapter. Why? Because even though we want to see a lot of articles cited in your dissertation, in your methodology chapter, we don't mind seeing textbook on research method. Sorry. So this is a part where we expect to see that you use textbook, because in your methodology you follow one or two you know, research method books, and those are what can be the basis of you choosing any kind of approach and philosophy for your research, and that's completely fine. Actually, I appreciate students who do that, because you know, if you find one book that you feel I mean, you understand, you like the approach of the book, and you follow that throughout your research for justifying why you're using certain method or data collection method, or you know, qualitative, whatever it is, it really helps you to be more aware. And the problem the students do is that they read different sources from different places and they get confused. While if you focus on one research methodology book and you follow that process, it's going to help you a lot in just, you know, make your life easy. You just straightforward follow whatever they're explaining to you, and it's just easily. So sometimes we ask you for the question of reliability and validity. I'm not going to talk so much about it, because again, today you're going to have a session about it. And for those who are going to do interview and, you know, especially interviews and service, please make sure that you attend this session. So validity is concerned whether the findings are really about what they appear to be. So validity determines what the research truly measures. And I give you an example. I did my PhD dissertation about conference attendee satisfaction. So literally, I was asking them why they attend a certain conference, so what is their motivation, what was important for them in their decision making, so the decision making you know, process, and then eventually if they were happy about, you know, attending. And you know, it was a system of questions they have to answer all at once. So one of the conferences I attended to collect data was in Singapore. So I was in Singapore and I was asking people to answer my, you know, to write down my question, which is not easy. People will not be happy to answer you a 5 pages of questionnaire. They will not be, some of them accept, some of them not. And in the middle of all that, one of the conference room had a problem. So they didn't have enough time. People were supposed to talk 15 minutes, but then it becomes 10 minutes, and then something failed. And people were angry So they come out, and I remember I'm there. For them, they thought that I'm there for some reason from the organization or something. They want to show their dissatisfaction. So they all come for my questionnaire to answer that questionnaire. But because they were unhappy on that certain conference, my question was their general point of view when they're choosing conferences, not that particular question. So what I had to do was dismiss all that 50 questionnaire that was filled out simply because it was not valid. It was not testing what it was supposed to test. What I was supposed to test is that asking professional people who goes 5 times a year for different conferences, why they choose certain conferences and how they evaluate their satisfaction. What happened is that 50 angry people come and take my questionnaire because for some reason they were unhappy about that particular session. That is not what I'm questioning. That was invalid. Is that clear? Hopefully it is. So now at that point, I was lucky. I was in the situation. I saw they were fighting with the event manager, so I had to dismiss because I didn't want my validity to be affected. But how will you know how to measure the validity? That's the process that if you have to go to the next session and you know, but literally what you have to do is that, determine the research truly measure that which what it intend to measure. So in other words, that the research allow you to hit the bull's eye of your research objective. So for example, I give you another example. How we do validity is simply is that we go, what I've done for my own reliability and validity of the research is that when I start to ask certain question, when I develop a questionnaire or when I want to ask certain question, I ask my other colleagues, professional, to come and check my questionnaire to see if the questions are clear, if what I'm asking is actually what they can see in the response, because sometimes they have multiple choices. Are there is there anything I'm missing? If what I'm measuring is actually what is going to be measured. For example, I'm just going to say certain things. If you're going to think about leadership approach of an organization, and you go and ask an employee, asking him, can you just answer this question? If you have to make it clear up there, this is a question about the overall experience of your leadership in that company. If it's about overall, for example, think about, so I have to give them a context. Think about the last 5 managers that you had in this company and fill out this questionnaire. Sometimes what happened, you give the questionnaire to person, you did not do proper work, so they're not aware, and they just talk about their immediate boss. For example, imagine they hate it or they love it. And then so is it valid? You're trying to see the leadership, for example, approach of an organization. So you need to know how many different managers, have acted differently, not just one manager. But if you don't give the context, if you're not asking the right question, if you just say, what do you think about your line manager? And then they say, oh, awful or lovely. But instead of asking, for example, think about the last 5 years of your experience in this organization and tell me overall, for example, experience you had from the last 5 managers. So that would be maybe a better question. So how do you ask? How do you know that it's valid what they're answering? You know what I mean? So reliability is the consistency of a set of measurement or measurement instrument. Will it measure the same result as the other occasion? Will similar observation be reached by observers? Now I'll give you another example. When I was doing my dissertation, I was studying, again, go back to the conference attendees because it's something that I have talked to you about. So I am developing this questionnaire that was developed before, but it was developed before in the context of another study. So I'm applying it to my study. So I have to think about my, certain characteristics of people or whatever conferences that come, and I have to change the whole questionnaire to make sure it's actually measuring what I'm asking them to. And then that's what some of you may say, I find a questionnaire from a research is very good. Yes, but you have to change it. You have to make sure that it's about your research, that is questioning your research. So is it valid? For example, some of you may have the Likert scale, and what we call a strongly agree, disagree, etc., etc. So you have to make sure for every dimension of the work you're going to do research, you have enough question to ask. And again, I'm not going to go too much on the details. I don't want to confuse you because you're going to have in the afternoon a question to that. So sometimes the threat to reliability is subject or participant error, like the example that I told you, you asking the wrong person. Like in the conference, I was asking the wrong person. The person was angry. Wouldn't be a fair questionnaire. So you're asking the wrong person. So I have to make sure that you're asking the right person. If you're asking about the leadership perception, you have to go up someone who has experienced different leaderships, for example, from person. So it's subject or participant bias. For example, sometimes you certainly ask from some people, and then you see that these people were biased. They were all managers or best friend of the manager. So it's not fair, you know, or they were all female, they were all male, or they were all of certain age, they were older. For example, if you would ask about you know, life satisfaction, if you ask a young for example crowd of their satisfaction of only an old crowd, is obviously is different. So it's bias. So an observer error, and sometimes you're observing something but it's an error because it's a one-time thing, and most of you are not going to do observation, so I'm not gonna open up that so much. But the reliability is to make sure you're asking the right person and making sure that you're not biased in the subject that you're asking. So this already, I see that yesterday you have talked about. So when we are talking about research method, you have to describe in your chapter, are you talking quantitative or qualitative or mixed method? Justification of why you have chosen each one of those, right? Then you have to tell us what kind of empirical statistics, for example, survey, experiment, or case study you're doing. So, and then who is it with? Like, what is the kind of, you know, things that you're doing? And then eventually you have to come off, you know, either compare whatever you've done or use the theory that you have done and explain more about it. Again, we have here qualitative, quantitative. I'm not going to talk through that because you're going to have a complete lecture on that. So I'm not going to follow that so much. But I just want you to know that we have types of quantitative, and you know, and most of you will go through survey. And then when we talk about qualitative, most of you will go through interviews, and it's nothing wrong with that. It's just what it is. And then we have mixed method, and the mixed method is a combination of quantitative and qualitative method of data collection. Okay, method of data collection may include a combination of, you may say, I have to do, because I'm doing quantitative, I may do positivism, and for qualitative, I'm gonna do interpretivism. That's normal because obviously you're using different methods, so may have different philosophy, may not. So the best way to do that is making sure that you have, again, for these deductive, inductive, you need to, all of this, go through a proper research method book and follow the whole process, because you need, even if you say I'm going to do deductive and inductive research, you need to justify why in your case, and for that you need to understand the whole concept around it. And so it's important that you read and you understand what they actually mean. The best things about research methods books is that they give you enough examples of understanding, especially if you go on business research method books, they give you a lot of examples of how this works, and it makes you better understand. Obviously, if you go back to the lectures of Dr. Mujahid, and today we're going to have 2 other lectures on quantitative and one day on qualitative, you're going to know more about it. But eventually, you know, it will help you to have a base, you know, for your research. Eventually, at the end, you have to have this idea. At the end of your proposal writing, you have to know what type of data suits your research. You know, what's the best way for you to ask research, right? For example, last semester, I had students who come to me and said, I want to ask people if it's better for them to have online or, for example, the difference between online marketing events, for example, and in-person event. And I'm saying, why you want to ask people about that? You need to ask those who develop marketing strategies. So asking the right people the right question, you know, don't always go for the obvious one. Just try to understand when and where you can get the right answer. What type of data has been obtained previously? Sometimes there are millions of people already done research and survey about an area. So making sure you're not just repeating another research. What the type of data can you obtain? Sometimes you have to be realistic. I ask people, where do you want to collect data from all over the world? I'm like, don't promise you're gonna save the world. It's too much to do in 12 weeks. From all over the world, you want to collect data? No, just try to be realistic. Find one sample size. Try to be persistent in approaching them, and just do it. So don't do too much. And then just try to understand what is your philosophy of research when you want to do your research. Okay, guys. Again, I did not go too much through the method simply because I know that there's going to be two good presentation done on the research methodology today, and then there is another one on qualitative that I'm going to go through, and so you're going to have all the details there. I don't want to be to say anything that repeat and repeat. It's going to get boring. We've got another I'm going to give you another like 10 to 15 minutes just to answer your question, and the question can be about methodology and just cannot be about methodology, because anyway I'm your module leader. So if you have any question, any worries, anything you want to share, this is the platform, guys. I'm going to stay so quiet. If you want, use the mic. If you don't want, just write down. You don't have to worry so much about your methodology chapter at this point. You just need to know more or less what you're going to do, and make sure that you have had this discussion with your supervisor, and what you're doing is possible and is okay, and that's something that your supervisor is going to tell you. Okay, so I'm here. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm gonna just stop recording because then it's just gonna be too much. So